everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
There came a time in 2012 when actually the industry, despite the fact that the laws made it pretty easy for the industry to advance, the way I say it, they wanted to find a way to make it even easier for themselves. And so they literally went behind closed doors and wrote a piece of legislation that was passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, and called Act 13, which really weakened environmental protections in the Commonwealth even further when it came to fracking operations. It put in place automatic waivers from environmental protection standards. It actually even preempted local zoning authority and prevented municipalities from limiting industrial fracking operations through their zoning to just that part of the community where industrial operations typically were allowed to operate. Instead, this law said that fracking had to be allowed everywhere in a community, including in the heart of the residential districts, with drilling and operating fracking well pads as close as 300 feet from people's homes.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Maya van Rossum, founder of Green Amendments for the Generations and a veteran environmentalist. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're a licensed attorney in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, as well as District of Columbia. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into environmental law and activism.
So I actually went to law school, not because I wanted to be an attorney per se, and certainly not a litigator, but because I wanted to be a better environmental activist. I just grew up loving the earth and trying to champion the earth and help the environment whenever, wherever I could. And I recognized while I was in college that, one, I really enjoyed the law. And two, that understanding what the law was and how it worked was very important in the environmental context and was a developing area when it came to environmental protection and environmentalism. So it just seemed like a great way to pair my interest in environmental protection with my interest in the law and my desire to be a better environmental advocate.
And I would say that in the last several decades, that has been incredibly instrumental and absolutely relevant for where we are today, correct?
Absolutely. Everything when it comes to the environment is really guided by, impacted by our laws, how they've been developing, whether or not their laws exist to address one issue or another, right? There are a lot of loopholes and gaps in the law. So when it comes to environmental protection, environmental law is critically important to achieve progress or frankly, to experience failure.
Yeah, great point. Great point. So tell us, what is Green Amendments for Generations?
So a Green Amendment is a constitutional amendment that gets added to the Bill of Rights section of our state and federal constitutions and literally raises up the environment and environmental rights so they are given the same constitutional recognition and protection as the other human, civil, and political rights we hold dear. Things like the right to free speech and freedom of religion, for example. Right now, we have those fundamental rights and they're constitutionally recognized and protected, but the right of people to essentials of life, like clean water, clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments, are not given that same highest constitutional and legal standing. A Green Amendment changes that. And at this point, I and my Delaware Riverkeeper Network organization were instrumental in breathing life, legal life, into a long ignored Green Amendment in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There's an amendment of this kind in Montana, and we just secured one last year in 2021 in New York. But other than that, there are no constitutional Green Amendments lifting up the environment to that highest constitutional standing anywhere else in the United States.
Well, we're going to come back to that and discuss that in more context, especially in the context of a lot of macroeconomic and political things that's happening. Now, in 2013, you testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee, and you opposed a bill that would make it easier to approve fracked gas pipeline projects cutting through creeks, rivers, communities, and so forth. What was the outcome of that?
So, as the Delaware Riverkeeper and leader of a 4-state organization called the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, which is the other hat that I wear as an environmental activist, and I've actually been serving in that role for 30 years, we've worked a lot on issues involving fossil fuels, fracking, frack gas infrastructure like pipelines, compressor stations, and liquefied natural gas export facilities. And there have been many times when the U.S. Congress has proposed legislation that frankly would make it easier and easier for frack gas infrastructure and or fossil fuel development to advance here in the United States of America, and to do so in ways with really devastating consequences for our environment, for people, and for future generations. That particular opportunity to testify was around a piece of legislation that was really going to weaken the ability of government officials to properly and fairly review and give oversight to fracked gas pipeline infrastructure. And I thought it was the wrong outcome. So I was invited by Congress to testify, as I've been a real leader in those issues as well. I mean, the truth is, we need clean and renewable energy options moving forward. They are available to us. And that is the path that we need to take. We need to veer away from dirty fossil fuels. And all this talk about carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen hubs, they're just different formulations of how to perpetuate fossil fuels. They're not the right solution. Clean and renewable energy is.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I have to take every opportunity to advocate in what I believe in.
Good. No, it's fantastic. And we'll come back to some of those things if we have time as well. There was a major victory in a case called Robinson Township Delaware Riverkeeper Network that I think you alluded to versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, fracking for gas from shale actually came to the Commonwealth, to the state, in about mid-2005. And given the state of the law at the state level and at the federal level, it was really pretty easy for the fracking industry to advance their fossil fuel extraction process. And to do so, frankly, with devastating consequences. They were decimating natural ecosystems, contaminating waterways, including drinking water supplies, of course, releasing air contaminants of all kinds, including climate-changing methane emissions, and really wreaking havoc, not just on our state, but on our nation and our world, and how they were advancing, the fracking industry was advancing dirty fossil fuel extraction. There came a time, and so at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, we had been working very, very hard to push back against this industry. There came a time in 2012 when actually the industry, despite the fact that the laws made it pretty easy for the industry to advance, the way I say it, they wanted to find a way to make it even easier for themselves. And so they literally went behind closed doors and wrote a piece of legislation that was passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, and called Act 13, which really weakened environmental protections in the Commonwealth even further when it came to fracking operations. It put in place automatic waivers from environmental protection standards. It actually even preempted local zoning authority and prevented municipalities from limiting industrial fracking operations through their zoning to just that part of the community where industrial operations typically were allowed to operate. Instead, this law said that fracking had to be allowed everywhere in a community, including in the heart of the residential districts, with drilling and operating fracking well pads as close as 300 feet from people's homes. When that law was passed, I and my Delaware Riverkeeper Network organization knew that we had to challenge it, because while fracking was already wreaking havoc, it was going to get exponentially worse if this law was allowed to go into effect. The thing is, how do you challenge a law that's passed by the legislature and signed by the governor? You don't really have many options, right? Because it's legal and it's legally defensible. You really have to have a higher power. And we recognize that actually in the Pennsylvania Constitution, from decades before, there was this environmental rights amendment in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that protected the rights of all people to pure water, clean air, and a healthy environment, and recognize the duty of all government officials to protect the natural resources of the state for present and future generations. Very early on, that amendment had been declared by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to be just a statement of policy, literally robbing it of its legal life. But we thought that this pro-fracking law was perhaps so egregious that maybe we could overturn that bad precedent. 7 towns, including Robinson Township, joined us in this litigation. And in December of 2013, we got a very powerful decision out of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court with a decision written by its very conservative Chief Justice, which actually sided with us and determined that if the provisions that we were challenging in Act 13 were allowed to go into effect, that it would violate Pennsylvania's constitutional environmental rights amendment, what I now call a Green Amendment. And so with that victory, we prevented those devastating aspects of the law from ever being implemented. But at the same time, in December of 2013, we breathed legal life into this long ignored environmental rights amendment. That's what set me on my path.
That's a terrific story. And I think the question that comes up for me is, for other states within their respective state, Bill of Rights and Constitution, are there similar provisions in there? So in the case of something like this ever passing in those other states, would there be a way to retract that?
Yeah. So after we had that victory, I actually looked at every state constitution across the nation. And what I found was that at that time, only Montana had an amendment like Pennsylvania's that put environmental rights on par with those other fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. And, that Bill of Rights placement, along with other essential criteria, really result in very powerful protection for the fundamental rights that are the beneficiaries of those criteria. So what I did was I identified what the elements were that made Pennsylvania and Montana special and unique. I called it a Green Amendment. And I set on this path to try to get this kind of amendment in every constitution across our nation, because almost every state talks about the environment. Some even talk about environmental rights within their constitutions. By my count, it's about 46 states, but only Pennsylvania and Montana, and then as a result of passage last year, New York, really recognize environmental rights at this highest constitutional level. But I do want to note that there are Hawaii, and as the result of a recent decision in Louisiana, there is trustee language about the obligation of the states to protect their natural resources for all the people, which is not in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. It doesn't recognize the individual rights of all people to a clean, safe, and healthy environment, but it has put in place some really powerful protections for the environment. And that trustee strategy that those two states use are actually part of what I would like to see in a constitutional Green Amendment. So I do want to recognize that those two states have had some really powerful court decisions by virtue of that language, but I do not think that it's the same approach as a constitutional Green Amendment.
Okay. And again, one of the other things that you mentioned in, I think, some of your writing is the fact that the Clean Water Act that was supposed to have, allow for zero pollution discharge in terms of the water by the 1980s really never really took effect, as an example. So clearly there is a lot of shortcomings, but fundamentally using the Green Amendments, we're trying to fill this legal gap to address the need for climate crisis. And again, the other thing that you alluded to just a few minutes ago is this notion of correlation between environmentalism and even racism in the sense of some of the marginalized people being affected more proportionally, disproportionately, I should say, to some of these fracking externalities, as an example. Right?
Yes, such good points. The way our laws are written at the state level and the federal level here in the United States, they're really focused on legalizing pollution and degradation, not avoiding the harm in the first place. As you said, the Clean Water Act does actually include a goal of zero pollution discharges to our waterways by 1986. When you tell people that, they laugh. They think that that's a ridiculous notion, but it's really not a ridiculous notion. We really can and should be focused on preventing pollution, degradation, and harm first. But the way our laws are written and the way they're implemented, they accept pollution and degradation as sort of this foregone conclusion, this necessary evil, and just focus on, well, what reviews are we going to do and what permits are we going to issue in order to legalize and lock in the pollution and the degradation that industry and developers would like to see happen. And another devastating outcome of this, and the way these laws are written and implemented, they literally do result in environmental sacrifice zones where communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities are consistently and continually targeted for highly polluting industrial operations and degrading environmental activities in order to sort of protect everybody else. And we just sacrifice them over and over and over again. And this disproportionate impact to these BIPOC communities is not just an accidental outcome of this system of laws, but in many, many ways, it is a very intentional outcome of how these laws are written and how they are implemented. When we raise up environmental rights to that highest constitutional level, bringing them above the law, we really transform the way environmental protection happens here in the United States of America. We transform it to a system focused on preventing pollution and degradation first. We transform it into a system where equitable protection of all communities is a constitutional must. You cannot have environmental sacrifice zones with this disproportionate impacting to BIPOC communities and low-income communities. When there's a gap in the law and loopholes in the law that allow devastating consequences, like the gap in the law that allowed that man-made family of chemicals known as PFAS to contaminate drinking water supplies and people's bodies across our nation. Well, if there had been a Green Amendment in place when that PFAS contamination was proliferating so quickly in such harmful ways, even though there was no piece of legislation or regulation for the people to turn to, they could have, if there had been a Green Amendment, they could have turned to the Green Amendment and their right to clean water and a healthy environment to get government to act in necessary and protective ways. So there are so many other benefits of this constitutional Green Amendment approach, but it's very transformational. And it really focuses on protecting the environment and protecting people first and not allowing environment to become just another sort of political jockeying point amongst politicians and with lobbyists for industry to sort of cut deals around in a way that suits them but doesn't suit the rest of us.
Yeah, I think your last comment was is very powerful and certainly germane as it pertains to what's happening now. In the context of inflationary environment, not just in the U.S., but really worldwide, and of course, the supply chain, specifically around energy, oil, and gas, because of the Ukraine invasion, has rippled across much of not just Europe, but the rest of the world. And what we're seeing is interesting because we see certain nations, in particular European and EU, and you see that, are very much ESG and climate change proponents or advocates, backpedaling a little bit because they're seeing that economically they're struggling, or because they see the gas prices going up, or natural gas during the winter, that's going to expect it to go up as well. Is they're saying, well, let's kind of ease up on some of these ESG matters, and let's see if we need to, temporarily increase coal, temporarily increase petrol-based energy, and so forth. I wonder how these the Green Amendments, which we're going to cover, which is also the title of your new book, can help secure some of these things that you're talking about, so that regardless of politically or economically what's happening, that there's something that can really stay firm and somewhat immovable.
Yeah. So it is 100% the wrong approach to turn us back to dirty fossil fuels and environmentally degrading activities under the guise of energy independence or lowering gas prices or whatever is the argument of the day. I mean, the truth is, those are the arguments of industry. Clean and renewable energy options are available today. We have governments in the US and around the world investing 4, 5, 6 times the amount of money in perpetuating dirty fossil fuels than in going down the clean and renewable energy pathway. If they invested those economic resources in clean and renewable energy, so many of those problems that you just mentioned would get addressed, but would get addressed on that clean energy path, which has benefits and protections for the climate crisis, right? And for future generations. So that's number one. Number two, we have to recognize that economic vitality and environmental vitality go hand in hand. When we degrade the environment, we degrade the economic health of our communities. When we enhance environmental protection, we create jobs and we create economic prosperity. So we are all better served when we stay dedicated to pursuing our goals in a way that is protective of the environment. And that is what constitutional green amendments do, or help do, is they help ensure that we have an ongoing recognition of the rights of people to clean water, clean air, a clean, safe, and healthy environment that is essential for their healthy lives, for our healthy economies, for job creation, and for doing right by future generations and protecting them. And so that Green Amendment, again, it transforms the way we think about environmental protection legally, but also intellectually and emotionally. And it ensures that we prioritize it every time we engage in actions and activities. And we don't just turn to the industry person to our right or the politician to our left and say, what would best serve you economically? Instead, we always look front and center at the people and say to the people, when it comes to the environment, what will serve you best and what will serve the people best is environmental protection.
So you have been already sharing a little bit of insights from your new book, again, called The Green Amendments. But I wonder if you could share other things that you haven't actually mentioned so far within the framework of this new agenda for promoting environmental constitutionalism.
So first off, you mentioned at the beginning about the U.S. Supreme Court rulings and some concerns that, well, how can constitutional environmental rights, that Green Amendment pathway, really be helpful when we have a Supreme Court that seems bound and determined to remove rights, and undermine the authority of our agencies? Well, by raising up the environment in that constitutional context, we actually help prevent the stripping away of fundamental rights, and we empower our government officials to do better when it comes to the environment. One of the reasons why the Supreme Court has been allowed to undermine environmental protections at the federal level is because of the lack of that constitutional recognition and protection. So if we place it in the Constitution, we bring the power back. But another thing to really touch on is when I talk about the Green Amendment movement, I really talk about working at the state level first, not hopping to the U.S. Constitution, because here in the U.S., there's a tremendous level of power in state government when it comes to environmental protection. Generally, the federal government sets sort of the bare minimum you have to do to protect the environment, but state government officials are allowed to be more protective over and above that. And a Green Amendment helps ensure that they are more protective, that they are more focused on that protection pathway and not just doing the bare minimum. State constitutional amendments are more accessible. State constitutions get amended all the time. So when we go down this state pathway first, we have a greater opportunity for greater protection sooner by getting state green amendments passed state by state by state, and eventually soon, as this movement grows and this powerful message spreads, we're going to hit a tipping point. And we're going to know that the people of the United States are ready to secure a federal amendment. And then we'll start to work for a federal green amendment because we need it at the state level and at the federal level. The other wonderful thing is, like as recently as yesterday, I continue now to get contacted by people from other nations saying, is there something in your message, Maya, for us in other countries? And I think we have a similar experience in other countries as we have here in the US. There's a lot of great language out there, but it doesn't always make a difference. You have to fulfill the right criteria using the right language with the right legal placement to really make a difference. And so I think a lot of our Green Amendment messaging here in the US can actually be helpful to those in other nations seeking to go down this stronger protective path.
Yeah, I think you make some excellent points, and certainly the strategy of tackling state by state and creating that critical mass and tipping point so that you could, in fact, have an impact at the federal level makes a lot of sense. But I wonder also, given the general geopolitical climates of things, where you do have not just kind of a dichotomy, but also deterioration of democracy in itself through intentional domestic misinformation, disinformation, and some parties and the conservative side challenging the woke movement and really pushing back on the whole ESG and climate change, even though they themselves and maybe their private homes, vacation homes are affected by hurricanes and the likes, are very much walking down this path of, drumming the beats of exactly what you're talking about. That's industry and lobby interest first. So how do we make these changes really take effect, especially in this kind of bigger movement where you have a pretty polarized, public, and maybe not all the public citizens are marching to the drumbeat that you're beating?
Well, certainly there are going to be voices and minds and representatives for industry and their friendly politicians that we're not going to convince, and maybe not because they don't understand the science and the facts, but they simply don't care because they're more interested in greed and money. So we can recognize that, but writ large, in the communities that I'm working in the over 15 states where this Green Amendment movement is starting to advance and take hold, one of the most interesting things that we're really seeing is that we are getting people of all political stripes to come together in support of a Green Amendment. We are finding that farmers and business operators and developers are joining with traditional environmental activists and ecotourism industries in support of constitutional Green Amendment protections, because they also are experiencing real world the harms of polluted water and contaminated air, whether it's on their business operations or on the health of their workers who can't come to work because of some huge flood that got induced, or because their workers are losing their health, right? They can't actually come to work, or in other ways. For example, there are many farmers that have literally lost their family farms, been forced to dump millions and millions and millions of gallons of milk because of water contamination, right? So what we see when we advance this Green Amendment conversation in states is we all need clean water. We all need clean air. We all are dependent upon healthy environments. We all enjoy healthy nature for recreation and time with family, right? And downtime. And so actually this recognition of environmental rights is a great way to start to bring those disparate voices and perspectives together around this common cause of protecting our right to get a clean, healthy, safe glass of water out of the faucet. And when we take a breath of air, to be able to do so with joy and not fear that we're going to die from a heart attack.
As a concluding comment is that I think we didn't exactly go into it specifically, but as we are talking in, kind of late 2022, is that water rights and the scarcity of water is becoming incredibly important. There's a number of things that's happening, from severe drought, multi-year drought on the West Coast, to the fact that you really, because of changing climate, the areas that used to get some level of precipitation is starting to dry out. So more and more of the U.S. is going to become drier, and then we're going to have less and less water. And that kind of middle zone where it's been dry is going to further encroach into the west, further encroach into the east as well. So a lot of these, small farmers to cooperatives and others that heavily depend on water for agriculture and their livestock, and of course for drinking, are going to really see the benefit of what you're saying. And I think going back to the state-by-state approach is that some of those states that are heavily agriculture-based, that are really being affected by the droughts and scarcity of water under the ground, but also from the rain, are really going to see the value of protecting the water source. Any final comments? We have just 1 minute, and then we're going to wrap up.
I think that's a really great observation. Right now, the way the system operates, it's that industry and developers are entitled to the water, right? And are entitled to pollute. And what a Green Amendment does is transform that so that we, the people, the farmers, the workers, we become the ones who are entitled to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. And our needs are prioritized first. And that's the way it should be. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share the Green Amendment message. I think you're right. It really makes a difference in the hearts and minds of everybody.
Terrific. And with that, I have been joined by Maya van Rossum, founder of Green Amendments for the Generations and a veteran environmentalist. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.